Hello and welcome to the 5th Annual Women Leaders in Cybersecurity Conference. Since 2016, we have brought together leading women from a interdisciplinary perspective to talk to us on critical issues in cybersecurity with strong backgrounds in government, academia, business, law, policy, and security. So welcome. This year, of course, it's a very different event. And indeed, this year has been a very different, our event is very different this year, I'd say. And this year has been a very different event. I think you got that, you're with me. It's been a hard year, 2020. We are so thrilled that we can meet even in this different way. And one benefit is it means that we've been able to bring together so many different people from all over the country. We're going to start right now with our Dean of the NYU Tandon School of Engineering, Yelena Kovacevic, who has an amazing background. You should take time and read her bio, but I will just say she is an amazing woman with technological expertise, leadership expertise, and cybersecurity know-how. Yelena, thank you for joining us today, Doctor, and I'll kick it to you.
Thank you, Judy, so much. Good afternoon to everybody, wherever you are. I'm excited to see 259 participants. This is amazing. As Judy said, this is the 5th annual Women Leaders in Cybersecurity event. And I want to take a moment to thank the entire Center for Cybersecurity, our colleagues at NYU Law School, my fellow faculty at NYU Tandon, and distinguished fellow Judy Germano for serving as program chair. I should also note that while this iteration has been going on for 5 years, the Center for Cybersecurity has been running programs encouraging women and girls, meaning of all ages, to enter cybersecurity. And so today's event has 3 major goals: to bring together industry thought leaders to discuss critical cybersecurity issues from technological, legal, policy, and business perspectives, to provide women experts in the field with a platform reflecting our own efforts to increase the number of women and people of color in the field, partly by increasing our presence in cybersecurity thought leadership, whether on panels, on organizational teams, in the boardroom and the classroom, which, by the way, will help us reach our 3rd goal, which is to inspire all women to enter and advance in cybersecurity, in which professionals are more than twice as likely to be men, not here, as you can tell, and STEAM fields through the inspiration and advice of the role models who speak at our events over the years. Clearly, there has been progress in advancing women's voices and leadership roles in cybersecurity, but also clearly more work needs to be done. The number of cybersecurity professionals who are women or from underrepresented communities STEM has increased, but we still need more women in the field, and salaries overall are on average below those of men. And also, while the COVID pandemic has significantly impacted everyone, studies show that the loss of jobs and harm to careers have been a harder hit for working women than men. We know that diverse teams have better success in handling and responding to crises, including cybersecurity events. So conversations and programs like today's need to continue, and I'm really, really grateful to all the panelists and number of amazing women for joining us today to share their expertise. We all know and have felt the impacts from this unprecedented, crazy year. In many ways, the fact that COVID has been a global event has brought us closer together. And during this global crisis, cyber criminals and cyber incidents have continued to persist and, in fact, have increased. And cybersecurity remains an essential priority and key element of any corporate risk management strategy, which is why this is one of our Tandon's areas of research excellence. And it spans multiple departments, and in the case of Center for Cybersecurity, schools and disciplines. Evolving technologies such as 5G wireless, digital manufacturing, healthcare, and many more are shaping how we live, communicate, and work, but they're also opening up vast new threat landscapes. It is increasingly evident that cybersecurity must be prioritized as an aspect of our everyday lives be it in business decision-making or as a key component of enterprise risk management and strategy. After years of being relegated as an IT issue, cybersecurity is now taking center stage at organizations across industries and in government. At NYU, we are training and supporting cybersecurity leaders through a number of programs, such as our Masters in Cybersecurity Risk and Strategy executive degree program. And that's a joint collaboration between the NYU Tandon School of Engineering and NYU School of Law, our Cyber Fellows online program, and the myriad cybersecurity programs within our academic offerings across the school. And it's a proof that the diverse and interdisciplinary approach to critical issues is better than a narrow view. And our interdisciplinary panel of experts today will discuss ways to better understand and address a wide variety of cybersecurity issues and threats, and share tools, technologies, and solutions to address them. For example, ransomware attacks have continued to rise at alarming rates, including at hospitals, causing a negative impact on public health. Data loss from intellectual property theft, including efforts to obtain and manipulate vaccine research, is a critical concern, and inadvertent disclosures and insider threats remain serious problems. We also need to be debating at the highest levels technologies that, while enabling insights into personal health, public safety, and convenience, such as surveillance tools for law enforcement, contact tracing for COVID management, and facial recognition tools, to just give a few examples, have a real potential to compromise privacy, foster bias, and even compromise our institutions. Meanwhile, the global landscape of regulations and liabilities continues to evolve to make cybersecurity risk management all the more challenging. These are but a few of the topics today's panel will discuss. To get cybersecurity right requires an interdisciplinary approach with valuable input from and collaboration among engineers, technical experts, legal advisors, business strategists, and policymakers. Today, we bring you such an interdisciplinary panel as we look forward to a new year, hopefully a healthier and a safer and much more fun than this one. So let me just close by again thanking Judy, everybody associated with the Center with Cybersecurity, my fellow dean at the law school, Trevor Morrison, and each of you for choosing to value the need for increased leadership from women in cybersecurity and realizing that diversity is integral to success in any, and in fact, all enterprises. Thank you again, and I wish you a wonderful, wonderful time. Judy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yelena. We are thrilled to have you and appreciate your framing and your describing of our conference and our joint collaboration between the School of Engineering, the School of Law, and really collaboratively recognizing the interdisciplinary work to be done and the expertise and the need for encouraging the existing women leaders and the up and rising future women leaders, as well as girls who are considering cybersecurity and other related areas for careers, because we really do need more of them, more of us in it. So thank you for joining us. And I think to the Dean's comments, it's an incredible example of how cybersecurity is at the front of our critical concerns for the nation, for our business, and for ourselves personally, was the disconcerting news last night regarding the attack on FireEye, a global leader in cybersecurity defense, an organization to whom many in government and the private sector turn to ensure that their systems are safe. And the news reports that a very sophisticated nation state actor stole the very hacking tools that FireEye uses to test vulnerabilities and for its customers. So it remains to be seen whether these tools will be publicly released, as happened in the 2016 NSA breach, or if they will be used to attack others, or perhaps both. But it really underscores on a day-to-day basis the evolving and critical issues that come up And I am honored to be part of a dialogue and conversation on these issues with some of the leading women in the country today and through our Women Leaders in Cybersecurity programming at NYU. For the ability to do this programming, I want to thank our sponsors. In addition to our NYU Center for Cybersecurity and the School of Law and School of Engineering, our Women Leaders sponsorship is supported very much by Craig Newmark Philanthropies and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, who make that possible. And today's panel discussion is also sponsored by Alston and Bird, a law firm who this year launched the AB Women in Cyber Network to bring many of us together who are working as the lawyers in the field and making sure that the leading thinkers and future leaders are talking to each other about these issues, again, from our companies, from our government roles, and collectively. So we have a wonderful lineup there today, and I see my speakers with me. I'm going to introduce to you. We have with us Jen Buckner, who is, and by the way, you should read their bios because all these women are amazing. I'm just going to give the top line stuff that doesn't even do justice to their amazing careers. But Jen Buckner with us is a senior vice president, technology risk management at MasterCard, a retired brigadier general of the US Army, highly decorated, a member of the board of directors of the US Express Enterprises, and the former deputy commander of US Army Cyber Command and the former director of cyber for the electronic warfare and information operations for the US Army. So welcome, Jen. We also have Caroline Krass, who is the senior vice president and general counsel for general insurance at AIG and the deputy general counsel for AIG. Caroline is the former general counsel of an organization known as the CIA, yes, and a forming acting assistant attorney general, principal deputy attorney general for the United States Department of Justice, former special counsel to the US President for National Security, and associate White House counsel in the Executive Office of the President. So welcome, Caroline. We also have Kim Peretti, who is an attorney at Alston and Bird in the private sector and co-chair of the firm's cybersecurity preparedness and response team and the National Security and Digital Crimes team. Kim worked as a former director for the Cyber Forensic Services Group at PwC and is a former senior litigator at the Department of Justice in the Computer Crimes and Intellectual Property section. And thanks to Kim, she is the founder this year of the AB Women in Cyber Network. Debbie Plunkett, we have, who sits on a number of different company boards, including BlueVoyant, Nationwide, JCPenney, and CACI International. She is a member of the Board of Advisors for the New York State Cybersecurity Advisory Board, a principal of Plunkett Associates, and the former senior executive and director of information assurance at a company or an organization, again, with its initials, the NSA. So welcome, Debbie. We also have Alicia Lowry Rosenbaum, who is the Vice President, Associate General Counsel for Cybersecurity Technology and Trust at Salesforce, a former senior attorney at Microsoft, and a fellow on the Leadership Council on Legal Diversity. Welcome, Alicia. And Rinki Sethi is with us as the Vice President and CISO of Twitter. News this week was Rinki was recognized as one of the top global CISOs, global in the world. Congratulations on that, Rinki. And she also is a former Vice President of Information Security at IBM. And Myrna Soto is a Chief Strategy and Trust Officer at ForcePoint. Myrna also sits on a number of corporate boards, including CMS Energy, Consumers Energy, Spirit Airlines, and Popular Bank, which you may recognize as Banco Popular or Popular Bank. So welcome, Myrna. So what a lineup. And again, those are just the highlights. You can go back and read their actual bios with all the good detail in it. But we have today a panel of experts to show diverse perspectives from government and industry and on a lot of work. I read something interesting from Forbes. A writer had said that in his 20 years of covering cybersecurity issues, he's remarked by how often things are the same, the topics, but then also astounded by how different the issues can be. And I think that that's a key point, because a lot of what we may discuss today may be similar topics and concerns that emerge year after year, but there are new and innovative twists and surprises and technologies that impact how we have to worry about those things and work to address them. So what I'd like to do as we happily put 2020 behind us and look ahead to 2021, turn to each of you and ask, what are the key cybersecurity issues that you would say are front of mind? Just a quick kind of hit off, and then we'll spend our time together drilling down into some of those topics. So Kim, what's on your mind?
Sure, just three quick things. One is endpoint management. Given the challenges we have with work from home and the changing landscape around work from home, securing our perimeter, I would say endpoint management is one. The second one, probably the second, 2, 3, 4, ransomware. I know we're going to talk more about that, but we have been living and breathing those attacks with our clients, and fortunately, the way that they're changing, the evolving nature of the attack is making those more difficult to deal with and respond to, as number 2. And then as number 3, global cybersecurity incident response, given the changing landscape of laws and notification requirements outside the United States.
Thank you, Kim. Myrna, what's on your mind?
Oh, if I only had more time. Thank you, by the way, for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with every single one of these just distinguished panelists. What's top of mind for me? Going into 2021 is the proliferation and the need to focus on insider threats. We have seen a number of very strategic campaigns to infiltrate companies as trusted insiders, specifically during this COVID-19 pandemic crisis, where we've been hiring and onboarding people without ever meeting them in person in some cases. I would agree with Kim that ransomware is top of mind for me as well, but just slightly different. And it's really what has been percolating up as ransomware as a service in the dark space. The ease of use, for lack of a better term, to acquire code that would penetrate organizations. The use of artificial intelligence and machine learning for automated incident response, another complementary aspect to Kim's earlier comments. And last but not least, the reality that we do not have a perimeter any longer. This is the unbound enterprise. The fact that we have such a huge amount of individuals working remotely, and the number of companies that were not necessarily prepared to have that type of shift happen as quickly as it did.
Thank you. Debbie, I'm going to turn to you. What is front of mind as we leave 2020 and look forward to 2021?
Thank you again, Judy, for the opportunity to participate in this forum among these great cybersecurity women. Well, first of all, I just want to get to 2021. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm about done with 2020 for sure. But for me, a couple of things, as bad as it has been throughout particularly COVID related this year, there are some things that we have benefited from and learned from. And I think their business operations will not be the same as a result. And I think so the ability to be able to take what we have learned and had to adapt. We think about, Zoom was not a verb in the spring of this year, and now it is. And the way companies have had to adapt to put appropriate security measures in place so that work from home could be not only possible, but feasible and done in a secure way. I think we have to continue to keep our eye on that ball, because as we conquer COVID, I believe we will have learned that we still don't all have to go to work in order to go to work. We can actually work from remote locations. And I think we're going to see an uptick, a continued use of work from other locations. So we have to make sure we're applying the right technologies to make sure that that's secure. The other is, it's related to the ransomware comment that already has been has already been shared, but more in the context of how do we prevent it from happening, and if we are doing all that we can to continue to reinforce to legitimate users, system users, it's the basics. It's the basic cybersecurity. It's the hygiene. It's, making sure you're not clicking on phishing links. It's making sure you're reporting any unusual behaviors. It's companies making sure they have the right level of auditing and oversight on their systems in place. And then the last is just one I've spent a lot of time on over the past couple of years. It's election security. We've just gotten through a huge election. But believe it or not, by January, the election cycle will start again, looking towards 2022. And so in that regard, making sure that, the lessons we've learned for 2020, we can push down, because cybersecurity isn't static. We will need to continue to reinforce those good behaviors in campaign space to make sure that we're able to protect the democracy and let elections run free and fair. That's what I'd say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Caroline, what are your top issues of the day?
First of all, thank you so much for having me, and I'm really honored to be with this distinguished group of panelists. My top concerns echo very much what others have already articulated. My top concern is ransomware, both in terms of the magnitude of the ransoms demanded and the types of attacks and how their sophistication has grown. I'm focused on third-party management and dealing with the risks that our vendors, create for the parent company, so to speak. The return to work and the most likely hybrid return to work and less return to work, and all the challenges that will come alongside related to the response to COVID and the increased vulnerabilities. And I think one thing, just to pick on what Debbie said, is we absolutely have to continue with the training. And I think people are more vulnerable right now. We're all anxious about things. And so we might be more likely to click on that link, that we're in a hurry, we're distracted, we have a million things we're doing. And so that's something we really have to keep reinforcing. And then finally, as Kim articulated, as multinational companies confront the growing number of laws, regulations, guidances from regulators around the world, it's really a continuing challenge to make sure that one is on top of all of that and acting consistent with the law.
Okay. And Alicia, what would you say we should be thinking about now?
Sure, and let me just say I'm so excited to be here. Oftentimes I'm the single voice in a room on these issues, and to be in a virtual room with all these ladies with all these exciting backgrounds is tremendous. And so just to build on some of the exciting things that I've heard, certainly one of the things that keeps me up at night is this notion of endpoint detection. What on earth is going on out at the edge? How do we, detect, protect, and respond out there? And I love what Myrna said about this notion of an unbounded enterprise. Where does an enterprise start and stop? There's this shared responsibility with our customers, free data flows. How do we define that? And how do we define, what the trust narrative is, what our duty of care is? Another thing that keeps me up at night in the context of being in-house at a large enterprise is keeping up with best practices such that our corporate governance is appropriate for our shareholders. And there's a lot of activity. I know we'll do a much more deep dive on that, but those are a couple of things that are top of mind too.
And how about you, Jen? What's your thought? Or what should we think about?
Well, I'd like to, build on the consensus here and just add a couple different things. So 3 quick hits. The first is, I'm really thinking about risk exposure. And I think many of us appreciate that it's not just, our primary offering, but the risks of our new acquisitions and our third-party vendors are our risks as well. And so having a common picture across all of that, I think is, a significant challenge in this space. The second thing, and on that same theme, is really shared situational awareness. I know, coming from the government side, what we could see, although I think it would surprise some people what we didn't know or couldn't see, and what industry does, and how do we, as a large company with small companies, how do we aggregate that picture so that we have a common understanding and appreciation for the threat landscape and, and can put all of that together. And then last thing, and I think for anyone, whatever size, company you're a part of, is what's good enough. Because I think all of us, know the ideal solutions, but from even a company with significant resources, we have to make trade-offs with, with our business lines, and with, some revenue impacts from this year. So what does good enough look like, and how can we make those risk-informed decisions on cybersecurity in business?
Thank you. And last but not least, Rinki, what are you thinking about, or what should we be thinking about as we enter into this new year?
Yeah, I'll repeat what a lot of my co-panelists said here. First of all, it's an honor being here with these amazing ladies. So thank you for having me. I'll mention two that that have been really on top of mind for me. One of the main reasons I recently joined Twitter is it's been top of mind, I think, for the world right now. And how do we protect the public conversation? And a lot of themes, one that Myrna mentioned around insider threat, and then others that have been mentioned play into it. But when COVID-19 hit and then the election, there was a lot of misinformation out there, some driven by cybersecurity issues, some not. And so how do we ensure that the public conversation is protected and people are getting the right information, the appropriate information when they need it? And I think that's going to be critical for 2021 and beyond. The second is protecting our remote workforce. One thing that comes top of mind is companies are going through acquisitions, and you haven't had to think about how do you control that data. And now people are at home having conversations, printing documents and things like that. And so are we providing a remote workforce, not just as it relates to the endpoints, but beyond that, in terms of how do you ensure information stays confidential and so forth. And taking that one step further, kids are using the internet and are on devices all the time, and ensuring that, I think our workplace has the responsibility now to ensure that parents also have the right tips and tools to teach their kids more about online safety.
Well, given the significance of these issues, I am, on one hand, we have a lot to be concerned.
Judy, you're frozen.
Right way to balance that with privacy and corporate responsibility and economics. So thank you for the overview. Given that a few of you felt that it's interesting, and I do know that it's in the news every day and seems to just keep getting worse, let's start with ransomware. We have seen a rise in ransomware, not just attacks that cripple systems, but then siphoning data and then leaking data, such as attacks on hospitals, putting patient data out there so that it's to up the ante and make victims more inspired to pay, and hospitals having to turn away cancer patients, for example, because they can't get their right treatments. Caroline, what are you seeing in this space in terms of key issues for understanding what to expect in 2021?
Well, Judy, just as you say, if you look at statistics for the first half of 2020 alone, ransomware attacks are up by 72%. I know across the insurance industry over the past few years, claims have just risen exponentially that have involved ransomware. And the U.S. government itself has been putting out advisories and more information about the threats posed by ransomware, extending sort of beyond where you might expect, not just talking, say, to the defense infrastructure base, or critical infrastructure, but FinCEN issued guidance on the same day as the Office of Foreign Assets Control, October 1st. And FinCEN was really drawing its client base or regulated entities' attention towards the dangers of ransomware. And some of the things that they highlighted was what's going on now is what they described as a big game hunting. Instead of the smaller companies being picked off for ransoms that were in the tens of thousands of dollars, now you have much bigger scale companies being targeted with demands that could be as much as $40 million. Just huge numbers that were not initially demanded. There was also an environment where the bad guys are sharing information amongst themselves more freely. And interestingly enough, even sometimes for free. I haven't quite figured out that, why there would be an incentive for the bad actors to conspire, without getting any remuneration. But, so that's another broadening of the environment of those who the good guys have to confront. And then, as you described, this phenomenon now of a double extortion. So you'll have, traditionally ransomware was a situation where a bad actor would get hold of a company's data, put it together and say, if you want the key to decrypt this, you need to pay us X amount. Now, in parallel, they're making copies of all of that data, and they're threatening, as you're identifying, the healthcare companies, for example. We have this very sensitive information, could be about the company itself, could be about the company's employees, about the company's customers, and we are not going to keep it confidential. We're going to leak it out unless you pay us. And so, on the one hand, the company might have adequate backups, so they wouldn't have had to pay the ransomware in sort of the more traditional sense, because they could make do. But now they have this concern that they have to pay so as to avoid the information becoming disclosed. And then if that information is disclosed, of course, there are all kinds of regulatory obligations in terms of notification to the affected individuals, to various state or international regulators. They're open to lawsuits, and so they have to actually act like they've been breached, even if they may not end up ever having that information disclosed. And then, of course, we always have the problem that sometimes the ransomware demanders, will not do what they say they will do. So one could pay, and then they could go ahead and leak the information anyway. They could go ahead and not give you the decryption key, and just so many issues associated with that, including the reputational risk.
I thought it was interesting. There seemed to have been a bit of a pact among certain attackers in April that they weren't going to attack hospitals. But I am reading from the headlines that pact has crumbled, and we're seeing continuing attacks in the healthcare sector as well as throughout business and other organizations. Debbie, let's talk tech for a moment. How is this happening, and what are the primary causes of these attacks?
Well, I mean, the causes of them are, the mechanisms used in order to successfully execute are not huge surprises. They are lapses in security, use of security measures and judgments by legitimate users of company systems. But there are also, with regard to those that are responsible for protecting those company systems, failure to implement security patches and upgrades in a timely manner, failure to have the right monitoring in place, to be able to detect even minute changes in the system protocols that might cause you to want to look more deeply. So, no huge surprises there, right? You get in the way that the getting in isn't just a huge surprise. It's then the extortion and everything that goes along with that in this ransomware as a service space.
And I think that makes a good point. One of our questions from the audience is that humans really tend to be the weakest link. So we need to address that and with training and other consequences. Rinki and Myrna both let's talk from a technological perspective, and then I'm going to turn to Alicia and Kim on a governance perspective. But what are the technical measures that companies can take to protect themselves against ransomware? Rinki, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think, one of the top things you can do long-term preventative is make sure you have a solid backup recovery solution. That's not going to necessarily prevent you from ransomware attack, but it will help you recover from one very quickly. I've seen in the news recently how many schools have had to shut down because of recent ransomware attacks. They're comparing it to a snow day where you would actually close a school because you're snowed in. Not something I'm used to in California, but that's what they're comparing ransomware to. And so it's devastating to hear that, there's no backup recovery plan from this. And there's a lot of companies that exist out there ransomware, helping protect other companies from ransomware by ensuring that you can quickly recover from it and that your backups are immutable and that your backups are not also open to corruption from ransomware. So I think that's the top thing. And I would say from a non-technical control, ensuring you've got a good response plan to deal with ransomware attacks.
And Myrna, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, the way I think about the technological implications to prevent, or more importantly, to detect, because I think the concept of trying to prevent the potential of malware for the purpose of ransomware infiltrating someone's environment is very difficult for all of the reasons we just discussed. The human element, phishing attacks that have gotten extremely sophisticated. With our current COVID-19 crisis alone, our labs group within ForcePoint has been able to detect over 1.3 million new campaigns for phishing attacks with the word COVID in it. So there's just this plethora of opportunity for the adversaries to use the tools. And going back to the ransomware as a service, the organization of the code bases being used against companies is quite easy. So because of that, I firmly believe that we have to have much better algorithms and detection mechanisms to understand the analytics of the behaviors and transactions that are happening in our systems. And what I mean by that is, and Judith, you mentioned, you know, originally it's seize someone's infrastructure and shut them down. We're seeing more and more that it's more on a very stealthy, low and slow data leakage type of campaign. I think it's really important that we use much more analytics around what our users are doing on the network. Why? Because the ransomware is going to attack credentials. The ransomware is going to attack an individual. We talk significantly at ForcePoint about a human-centric approach to cybersecurity. It is still the #1 vulnerability that we have. There's a whole other panel that we could discuss about what we could do with that. But when it comes to the technologies, you know, the ability to, and may sound controversial, but the ability to study some of that code, be able to reverse engineer some of the malware code that is out there available for ransomware purposes. And of course, organizations such as mine do that on a daily basis in order to harden protections and to harden the technologies that are used to detect malware for the purpose of ransomware. You know, throughout my career, I was fortunate enough to be a global CISO for a greater portion of my career. And I was very unpopular when I was at an event and they asked me, would I ever pay on ransomware? And I said, no, absolutely not. I said, never pay. And one of the reasons is because one of the things that we did in our organization as one of the largest internet service providers is that we worked with the various three-letter law enforcement agencies to try and prevent the success of ransomware. Because at the end of the day, it is an economy. And when the economy is successful, it will continue. So there's a number of things that we can do, but I really am a firm believer that it comes down to the analytics, network behavior, the use of data, and how data is our new oil. We need to understand how it's being used, where it's going, and to be able to detect anomalous, abnormal behavior of users.
So given the human-centric approach and issues related to ransomware, as Myrna just mentioned, Kim and Alicia, I'm going to turn to you in terms of what, from a governance perspective, should we be doing to address this problem?
Sure. I think all companies need to have a plan, you know, triggered by data unavailability, whether it's ransomware or others, or some other scenario where you or your customers cannot get access to that customer data. And so I liken it to, you have to have a bad guy plan. One is around engagement. For various reasons, some of the individuals on the other side that you may or may not be interacting with are various levels of unsavoriness, I'll call it. So do you have a third-party intermediary? Do you have methods by which you can go to your board and say, hey, I need $5 million in Bitcoin. Where do I get Bitcoin on short notice? Is that something that you hold on the books? And just backing up to Myrna's point, all of this presupposes you've decided to engage and pay. That's also something you need to socialize internally about whether or not, what's the corporate stance on that? Under what circumstances would we pay? What are our peers saying in the ecosystem? What's best? What's the duty of care here, the best practice? Having those conversations well before something befalls your company or your organization is really a good route in terms of corporate governance.
Maybe I can add to some of Alicia's comments. So I totally agree that for many cyber crises, they require a cross-functional response. Often we'll need executive decision-making in a crisis situation, but ransomware is unique. It has different aspects to it, and we have been working with clients for the past 2 years to do tabletops that involve ransomware to really inform executives and even the response team members of various client organizations on what is a ransomware response? What does it look like? How do you be prepared? Because it's very different than other types of cyber incidents. You immediately might need to have 4 work streams. You might need to have a restoration work stream, looking for your backups, restoring your data, a communications work stream to communicate to employees about laptops, data they may not have access to, a legal work stream to start working through any legal issues if there was data that was exfiltrated, a communications work stream, legal, an investigation to investigate what happened. I mean, in some ways, these ransomware attacks are no different than the state-sponsored attacks the targeted attacks we were investigating a decade ago, where criminals get through the front door, they drop malware, they start to escalate privileges, they move around in the environment, sometimes weeks, days, weeks, months before they deploy the ransomware, which is the last stage of the attack. So really informing executives on what these ransomware attacks are like and what the response needs to be and how you need to be prepared is critical. And how do you do that? One thing that we've worked on with many companies is to have a ransomware policy. There have been policies companies have had that outright prohibit paying criminals or paying any ransom, largely stemming from kidnapping policies. But we know that you may need that flexibility to pay in some circumstances. And it may not be to get the decryption key, but it may be the double extortion we're seeing more often, just for some protection that the criminal says that they won't post your data, your very sensitive customer data publicly. So working on a ransomware policy that helps identify under what circumstances the executive team may make a decision or may consider, what factors they may consider in making the decision to pay. Having that policy in place allows them to turn to something to work through the process of decision making and very, very quickly. We found that can help, in addition to having a ransomware playbook that outlines the different workstations, how you engage these third-party intermediaries, how you might pay, outlines the OFAC guidance and other legal considerations, just so it's all in one place and the company is familiar with how they need to approach the response.
So Jen, you have, in addition to your current role from your prior life with U.S. Army, you have amazing insight into the critical infrastructure issues and concerns regarding cybersecurity. And with the ransomware attacks, we have seen a number of state and local governments under attack. Does this question of pay or not pay change for a municipality or for a critical infrastructure organization?
Well, I guess in this space, being that certainly there's an evolution on the stance. I like that analogy to hostage or policy on the payment of ransomware. And I also think we're seeing a movement in the government's role in responding to these, because I think that the North Korean involvement in the Sony hack really compels a different framework for these response when private sector companies, are the victims of what is a nation state actor in those techniques. So I don't quite know the answer, but I appreciate that the current circumstances are informing a movement on this, and that it's certainly not black or white, yes or no. It's definitely, it depends. And I think, it's scenarios like this which compel movement in here. And I think, so it's very different than it was 5 years ago, even in today. So I think we'll continue to see that movement. But to also pick up on your idea, the idea of consortiums. And I think we do see, critical infrastructure groups, like the energy sector has done such an amazing job in terms of working together to share information, what they're seeing, the identification of threat actors, techniques, and responses, and then a coordinated response. And so I think from a sector perspective, we can follow the energy sector in this. And I think where we see like businesses or industries coming together to do this, that is so important to our collective cybersecurity and posture, not just as a product of business, but also from a national defense perspective.
And Debbie, do you think that this new flavor on ransomware of releasing sensitive data, including patient health data, changes the discourse or decisions within organizations about whether to pay or not? Because on one hand, there's a strong motivation not to pay, and on the other hand, there's also strong obligations to protect the most sensitive types of information. And what kind of questions should companies be discussing regarding that?
Well, they should be discussing them with their attorneys for sure, and with federal officials as appropriate. I think ultimately it's a risk decision, and the company is going to have to make that decision based on their level of tolerance and based on the potential for impact to them, either financially or reputationally. We have to keep in mind that in my view at least, we don't want to reward bad behavior. And we want to try to avoid rewarding bad behavior. And so to pay is not only rewarding bad behavior, but we have no guarantee that the bad behavior is not going to reappear. In fact, it seems to me that we're probably writing a check knowing that we might be writing another check, right? And so all of that has to be taken into account. But most importantly, it's to surround yourself with wise counsel, and hopefully, for corporate entities to be having these discussions right now before something bad happens, so that they have a sense of what the company's tolerance is for risk, so that when they have to make this decision, it is not quite as difficult.
And one of the issues in the guidance, right? So hackers know companies are in a bad spot, and they're capitalizing on that. And in addressing that, though, the government has issued, as Caroline mentioned, the strong, the OFAC guidance that it would be that you should not be paying for ransomware if it's somebody on either a country or this nationals list that we should not be doing business with. And that is not just for the victims, but for others who are facilitating the payments or responsible in the chain of payments. Kim, from your former time at DOJ, do you think that is a signal that victims should worry about being prosecuted as well under this, or how do you take this new guidance?
There certainly are criminal and civil penalties attached to OFAC violations, but at least from this particular guidance, it's focused more on civil penalties and reminding everyone, there's no new regulations here, that it's a strict liability standard. Should you pay, even if you have no reason to know that you're paying someone, an entity on the sanctions list, that you could be subject to civil penalties. And OFAC is reminding us of that standard in this guidance. The challenges stem from, in ransomware incidents, most often all you receive from a criminal is an email address and a Bitcoin wallet to pay. And those Bitcoin wallets change frequently. So even a company with a good due diligence program for any transactions that they make, and then of course we rely on the third-party intermediaries that we hire to make the payments to also do due diligence. We also often check with the FBI and law enforcement when we pay it with the Bitcoin wallet, if they've identified it in any related to any terrorist organization. So even with all those steps, OFAC is reminding us that it may come to be that the Bitcoin wallet that we're paying is associated with an entity. That there's a sanctions nexus. So I think it's a reminder, and whether OFAC moves forward as the government continues to indict more and more companies for cyber criminal activity and put more entities on the list, I think it's just a question of whether OFAC would indeed go back and identify companies that have made payments, even if they had no reason to know, and bring an enforcement action against them. Of course, they're making it quite clear in the guidance that having a due diligence program is important, but even more, what I find more important in the guidance is that they say if you have a significant, if you coordinate with law enforcement, that's a significant mitigating factor in their decision to bring an enforcement action. So we really view this guidance as if you are going to take steps to pay criminals, that you absolutely should be coordinating with law enforcement.
I hate to interject because I know Judy wants to, we have a big panel, but I couldn't agree with you more. And the coordination with law enforcement implies something, transparency. And the issue with ransomware, and to Debbie's point about let's not reward this behavior, is there's just way too often the lack of duty of care to secure enterprises and secure data. You can still be a victim, but if you have expressed that duty of care and you have done your best effort, you may still be a victim. We should not be shaming victims. And the shame of victims is what allows companies to say, let me just resolve this, let me just pay. And then that entire cycle is just a vicious cycle, and I can't see it ending until we don't pay.
You should all interject. We're here for a conversation. And by the way, I know that we could fill 2 hours with any one of you and it would be phenomenal. So we're just going to get through as much as we can, and we're thrilled to have all of you. So we'll let it flow. But with that, we're going to take...
I do want to highlight, one other aspect of the guidance, which is, it does apply to intermediaries. So that includes the negotiator potentially of the ransomware. It includes the insurance companies, explicitly. And one thing that it assumes in a certain sense is that one knows whether or not the ransomware has been perpetrated by an SDN, especially designated national, or by a particular country. It might be easier to tell the country versus the SDN. But oftentimes you can have a situation where you can have one incredibly well-respected forensics firm saying, we think this has the same signature as this SDN. We think it's quite likely that this demander of ransom is that bad actor. But then you can have an equally reputable firm saying, we don't think so. We don't think we have enough to tell that. And so it puts all the company and all of these intermediaries in a very difficult position. How sure do they have to be? And they may not be, of course, they're not expert in it. This isn't the kind of thing that most companies know how to determine, the signatures of bad actors. And so I think a very interesting question is, what is reasonable in this circumstance such that OFAC will not come back again against the company or its intermediaries in terms of sanctions. And I think most companies are going to be more careful. They're not going to go ahead and do it unless they absolutely have to, and then find out later. They want to know ahead of time, and OFAC will consider license requests. But it's very interesting because the guidance is just articulating laws that were already in effect, but especially with, as Kim indicated, the focus on the credit one would get for cooperation with law enforcement. I think that's a new development in terms of having that explicitly stated, and it does push, I think. It does address these, bring up the challenges that Myrna mentioned in terms of shaming the victim, but it certainly pushes a company towards that cooperation with law enforcement.
So I think the bottom line before we leave ransomware is it's incredibly important. We're seeing a lot of it. You need to talk about it within your organizations and with your technological and legal advisors, because there's a lot to navigate from these issues. And the more you do it ahead of time, the better. We need to take a quick pause to provide our CLE number for the lawyers in the audience who get CLE credit. So we'll do that, and then we're going to jump to insider threats.
So for those of you who can't see the screen right now because you're calling in, the first CLE code is EAGLE 52. That's EAGLE52. I'll repeat it again, Eagle52, EAGLE52. All right, do we think we're good?
Thank you. Yes. So insider threats, we have this huge shift in 2020 to a remote workforce, which brings a wonderful opportunity to have globally diverse teams, but also raises questions of data security and data protection and insider threats. Rinki, what are you seeing as key concerns in this space?
Yeah, there's a few things I think when it comes to insider threats. One, and I think when folks think about insider threat, a lot of times you think malicious, but insider threats can also just be risks and not malicious. So there's some key things I think to think about, and as everybody knows, that Twitter definitely felt the pain of lack of education when it came to our insiders and how they were using technology as the breach had happened a few months ago. And so I think that one, all your employees and insiders need to be protected in the, with the right tips and tools and understand what the limitations around technologies are and where they have responsibilities, and ensure that they have the right knowledge around social engineering and phishing and all of that. And as we all know, that's not necessarily enough around insider threats. So some of the things is, again, when I think about insider threats, I think back to how are we going to protect the public conversation as it relates to insider threats, and ensuring that there's good access management within a company, that there's ensuring there's good access controls, and that we've got visibility and we've got the right tools to flag when we feel that there's some kind of issues that somebody might be doing something malicious, or maybe even inadvertently pushing something to production that shouldn't, or so forth. So I think there's a lot of things to think about when you think about insider threats, and there's a lot of questions too in terms of what can you do when folks do have access, when your employees do have access to really critical assets in the company, in terms of, and this is where we cross over with legal implications as well, in what can you do in terms of background checks, and how can you implement more controls that way too, to make sure that you're preventing malicious actors from entering to begin with.
And Jen, what are some best practices that you can share with us for managing a remote workforce?
Well, I think like most, this is a journey that we are, figuring out as we go. And I think, early on when we federated the workforce, and we really had to make some tough calls on known risks, but also the ability for our employees to work and that ease of work. And so those risk reward trade-offs, we made some early decisions. And of course, the ability to come back and address those. There are certainly, it's put a premium on logging and monitoring tools, immediate visibility into how our employees are working, what they're accessing. It really compels a tough look at privileged access. And I think, now as we know that the future of work is some sort of hybrid of this, how we can continually test and validate those controls and ensure our visibility on what's happening in the environment real time. So again, I don't know that there's any one answer or posture, but the continual evaluation to, again, balance the risk along with, the user experience, the employee experience, and our must-do critical missions as well. I think it really, has shrunk the hybrid, what we see in, I think, we've all gone to like digital signatures and reviews and things like that, but there's still a couple things that still have to be printed out and signed, hard copy. So, again, those are all journeys that we're on in the controls validation, risk, user experience, and logging and monitoring.
Debbie, from a board member perspective, we know that the board oversees and doesn't manage, but what are the questions that board members should be asking or that senior management should be prepared to tell the board about in terms of insider risk management and what to think about in this space?
Sure. So, boards should be getting some type of regular report from management on the status of the company's efforts to protect and as needed defend its network and data and personnel. And that can come in a number of different ways, from literal reporting to having experts present in different ways. But that should be happening on a regular basis. Board members should be asking, what's the investment? Because that's an area that boards care about, is how are the stockholders' dollars being invested? So what's the investment in technology and security? The board members should have a sense of what is normal for this company as it relates to cyber incidents and security, so that when a really, really bad thing might happen, the board would understand what that bad thing means in the context of what normal looks like for the company. And then the board should be asking for some type of flow chart or structure to escalate should some bad thing happen, such that the board would be notified as appropriate if required, if it reaches that threshold.
Thanks. Really insightful thoughts, not just for insider threats, but for other cybersecurity risks, the challenges of escalation and the dialogue of communication. And Myrna, I think as someone who works very closely on insider threat management in your work at Forcepoint, and then also sits on a number of corporate boards, what's your thought on how we should, both companies and their advisors should be addressing this concern?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things, and I'll be the one to break glass. And I'm sure many of my fellow panelists will agree to an extent that one of the imperatives around insider threats is the balance of protecting employee privacy, right? So their activities on, unfortunately now in this environment, more often than not, shared devices, the ability to understand what people are doing with their credentials and their privileges. And I often say that, we all want to trust that every single one of our employees have the greatest regard for the corporation at hand. But the reality is that people are under a tremendous amount of stress. People are under a tremendous amount of pressure, and there are adversaries that work for us. I mean, this is just fact. The data and the statistics will show that. And in the boardroom, the considerations are to make sure that we don't over-index on that trust. Jen said it well when, she described this continuous assessment. One of the things that I love that, and I rarely say this, by the way, one of the things I love that Gartner put out as far as an imperative for security is the concept of CARTA, which is continuous adaptive risk and trust assessment, and really adopting a zero trust model for your users. Now, users could be employees, third party. I know we're going to talk a little bit later about third party risks. There could even be machine accounts, right? Automated machine accounts. I think that we have to realize that over the last decade or so, probably the last 2 decades, we have employed a number of technologies to help prevent data leakage, data exfil, network intrusions, all of these things. And yes, that the whole defense in depth approach has served well, not perfectly, but well. Really, our only real defense now is to understand and monitor. And that concept of monitoring kind of puts an uncomfortable feeling in some people's necks, because where do you draw the line or snap the line and say, I am monitoring activities on my network, on my assets, on my data, right? And ensure that you're not over-indexing and monitoring behaviors that an employee may have on a shared device that could later be mishandled, used in some biased format, all of these things. These are all the things I think about. We at Forcepoint, we are levering up on behavioral analysis, being able to apply, I like to call it the FICO score to your activity. It's a risk score. And I'll use Debbie as an example. Debbie is a certain role. She's accessing certain data That's normal for her. I'm not going to be intrusive and monitor. But suddenly now Debbie's activity has changed and it's abnormal. And to be able to automate some of that continuous assessment, I think is the way for us to kind of tackle insider threats. But at the end of the day, every single company that we talk to about this worry immediately, what about my employee privacy? What about my multinational, I operate in many countries, some countries won't allow me to do this, etc. So it's, you know, no perfect answer, but I know that you know this. I believe that the only way for us to be more detection centric and preventative centric is to really understand how the behaviors of our users may be elevating our risk profile.
In February, we're going to have a women leaders conference that drills down on privacy, which is a huge issue in privacy and cybersecurity at the intersection there. But while it's hot on the screen right now, what about employee privacy? If you're watching and monitoring, maybe you're responsible in protecting the privacy and information on the systems, but at the same time without being creepy. Kim, legally, talk to us.
Well, you know, often, you know, we will have the ability to be creepy from a legal perspective on corporate systems. And within the United States, you know, we have the wiretap laws and some other special laws, but we're often able, because it's corporate equipment, it's corporate data with the appropriate, you know, information provided ahead of time to be able to do pretty extensive monitoring. So, you know, as Myrna discussed, you know, it often becomes one of an issue of transparency, of the level of transparency that the organization may want to be with its employees. I think we have use cases of some significant insider threat programs in some large financial institutions that were legally performed with fantastic technologies, but then leaked and, you know, employees became aware and it was just shut down immediately. So often it isn't as much of what we legally can do, again, on corporate systems and corporate data as it is a question for the company from an employee transparency perspective.
And recognizing those critical issues of making sure you're following the law, but then also doing what the company is comfortable doing if it gets on the front page. It's important to have governance structures. Alicia, what are some of the governance structures that should be put in place with regard to these privacy concerns and also an adequate employee monitoring and safeguarding?
I think building on the transparency notion, I'll say a couple of things. So I was formerly at a company, Microsoft, that sort of specialized in enterprise software in building some of these tools to automate both role-based access and akin to that, following on what Myrna said, you can really drill down on user activity and what's the conversation about what that looks like from a transparency perspective and trying to figure out where that creepy line is. And so one of the things to your question you can do is anonymize data. You can follow patterns to see perhaps where your enterprise is leaky, if you will, by following trends and not people, and then build something appropriate. And that, you know, seems to be a bit of a better place to land with your employees. They don't really feel like they're being followed, but that trends are being watched. So that's one suggestion I would make.
And if I may, I apologize, I did not mention this, but one of the things that we have adopted as a principle to assure companies around how to protect employee privacy is for the security analysts that may be operating these tools, we have completely pseudonymized the data. So there is no attribution to the employee. To your point, Alicia, spot on. It's less about the person, it's about just the activity. And when it reaches a certain threshold, of course, there's a different conversation.
So it sounds almost like the COVID pool testing, and if everything is okay, but then if you have a positive, you have to look a little more closely at that sample.
But I think some of the COVID testing is actually, you know, such an interesting use case at the intersection of data, of privacy, of security, and the governance regulatory landscape. Because of course, there are a lot of things we can do. There are a lot of things that localities are doing, but also we have to ensure workforce safety, especially in the hybrid return to work. But then there are also different national guidelines, which for global companies, that precedence is an interesting dialogue. And so, what we can monitor, should we monitor, and what's the framework for that is the dilemma I think that many of us are facing.
Really excellent point. And it elevates the concern of corporate responsibility and the importance of having these conversations, again, at the senior leadership level and at the board level, to make sure that there's assessing the corporate responsibility and accountability appropriately. Rinky, Myrna mentioned about these great algorithms and user analytics and detection. There have been cases where there are concerns that they are coded in a way that result in bias. How do we address that? And what are some of the issues with regard to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been top of mind around machine learning and AI for a while, not just as it relates to cybersecurity, but just more broadly to anything where you might be using that. So there's a few things that come to top of mind. I think ensuring that you have the right learning model. In some cases, the learning models might be unsupervised, where you're using machines to do the learning itself. In some cases, it will be supervised, where you will need human intervention. And then ensuring that if you are doing a supervised model, you're then using a good representative of that's you have representatives where you're using different folks from different backgrounds. So you're reducing the bias, because anytime we do supervise, there will be bias that's introduced. I think also ensuring that data sets that you're using are representative of the whether it's your customers or whether it's your employees, that it's really representative of your it's not just like one local group that you're going and identifying, but it's a very diverse set of data. And then I think third thing is you have to make sure that things are working before you go live with them. And so ensuring that you're monitoring how is your machine learning AI responding to different events and different things that might be happening, and is that expected with your diverse data set that you're using. And I think then that's how I think you can reduce bias in what we're doing around machine learning and AI in cybersecurity or even beyond that.
Caroline, as in-house counsel, how do you assess for these issues that we've been discussing? How do you assess when they should get brought up to the board and to the board's attention, and the depth of information you would provide?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And best practices continue to evolve in this area. So with respect to cybersecurity more broadly, I think that it's important that it's a regular agenda item on board meeting agendas, whether they be monthly or quarterly, so that even if you only have a 5-minute update, the board is constantly being engaged on these issues, understands and has approved on an annual basis the information security policies, is asking for updates about what has gone wrong, if anything, what kinds of attacks we're seeing as a company, and what actions are being taken to mitigate that risk. And I think, I know one question that people discuss, it's quite a heated topic, is whether or not there should be a particular board member who is the person who has that cybersecurity expertise. And I think as long as you have people who are able to ask the hard questions, and perhaps you have a subcommittee of the board that is focused on cyber, you may not need to have a particular person dedicated to cybersecurity in a way that might spread out make the responsibility not as spread out as it should be. On the other hand, it's incredibly helpful to have somebody who speaks that language, and so I certainly wouldn't discourage it. I think one thing that's really important is to have CISOs who report regularly to the board and who can speak, understand the language, the level of granularity, and the way to explain things to the board, such that they're not dumbing things down, but it's clear what they're trying to convey. And then also, I think the board has a responsibility to make sure that the CISO has adequate resources in terms of staffing. But again, as it was said earlier, you can't have everything be perfect. There always are going to be trade-offs in terms of where resources are prioritized. Nobody has an unlimited budget. And so one has to focus on the highest degrees of risk.
Can I pick up on that theme really fast?
Sure.
Carolyn, I love this, because I think we all face the challenge of conveying what is very technical or complex subjects and material, to a large audience, whether it's a board or, more operationally across the company. And so in cultivating and recruiting talent for cybersecurity teams, I have found, great use for storytellers and people who can, as you point out, take these topics and distill them into tell a story. And that had that resonating with board members in the same way that I guess as a government member try to communicate with legislators or other people framing policy. I think that marriage of cybersecurity and storytelling is why cybersecurity is such an interdisciplinary sport or a team sport, because if we can't communicate that in the way that you're describing, we're really not doing, we're doing a disservice to whoever we're working for or trying to support, and really to frame the decisions around those. And I think many on this call would share that, but I like teaming with whether it's my communication specialist or it's others outside of my security team to come back and tell me, are we saying this in the right way? Because that challenge is real.
It comes down to business acumen. And it's one of the biggest things that, and I'm sure Debbie would agree with me, that we've seen CISOs kind of gravitate to. You used to be a primary technician and you couldn't speak English and no one in the boardroom knew what you were talking about, to moving that pendulum over to having that business acumen and doing that storytelling. And I would be remiss if I didn't make one comment about the importance of having a subject matter expert in the boardroom. Obviously, I am very biased. I am a subject matter expert that serves on 3 publicly traded boards, and I have seen the value of having that knowledge in the boardroom. We would never say that we wouldn't want a financial expert for the audit committee. We would never say we wouldn't want a legal expert in the boardroom, which, we have a variety, a diversity of skill sets in the boardroom. I think what matters is it may not necessarily have to be a previous cybersecurity professional, but think of it as the digital director, someone that has the technical acumen that can translate to that same business acumen. When I joined my first publicly traded board, the CIO and CISO of that organization came over and hugged me because they said, finally, somebody's going to understand what I'm talking about. And on the flip side, another board, I joined and someone said, oh no, she knows what I'm talking about. So there's a dynamic there.
Red flag.
Exactly.
And Debbie, as someone who spends a lot of time in the boardroom, what are your thoughts on that? Both as an outside advisor coming in and as somebody who actually has a regular chair that you get to sit in at meetings.
Right. Yeah. So I agree with Myrna for sure. I think realistically, many boards can't afford to use a seat for a cybersecurity expert only. And so for those of us that are in the field and have other competencies, we should be talking about them just as much as we talk about cybersecurity, about leading large organizations and managing risk and managing resources. Because, for a board of 9 or 10 or 11, they need board members who really can focus on a couple of different areas. But, I agree and I agree with everything that Myrna said. It's a blessing and a curse to have someone who has cybersecurity expertise on the board. What I've found more often than not is, willingness to pull me aside on a break or give me a call before a meeting and say, can I run this by you? Or what do you think about this? Or have you ever heard of this product? And I welcome that engagement. And what I've tried to do, and I encourage for others who ask me about this, is, not to be the know-it-all at the table. Because it could be very well that the best thing for me to do is to deliver that same courtesy, pull someone aside at a break and say, have you thought about this? Or did you take a look at that? And, management appreciates that so much more. And you can build the right relationship such that when tough times come, you have already, you know, that right relationship in place for the board to be able to do its job, which is delivering on that stockholder value.
Well, picking up on Jen's comment about storytelling and the interdisciplinary need to articulate all of the different issues. I mean, that's part of what we try to do through our conference programming, and also with NYU's Masters in Cybersecurity Risk and Strategy program, which is training the storyteller leaders, both on the technology issues and on the legal and policy issues there. So Rinki, as a global recognized CISO, what types of information, partnerships, tools do you need from the others, let's call it the lawyers and the other people within the organization, to tell your story to executives and to senior leadership and to the board? And then Kim, I'm going to ask you that question from the lawyer side. What do you need from the CISO team in terms of artifacts of compliance and the rest? So Rinki, I'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't even think about it at the time of the board meeting. It's my partnership with legal and other teams, finance and whoever else it might be, continues like every single day. There's not a day that goes by that I don't talk to our lawyers or our privacy team. And we're constantly sharing information, and usually they'll be in the boardroom when the cybersecurity report goes out as well, to either support or partner or talk to even pieces that might be more related to privacy, or, you know, to other areas, to finance or whatever we might be talking about. I think the type of information, you know, whether it's related to GDPR or FTC orders that we're responding to as a company or whatever it might be, that's all information that we'll pull together, that you need to have a really strong cybersecurity, legal and trust and privacy function in order for us to get this right at a company like Twitter. And even in the past, these are functions that we worked really closely with and our partners in reviewing the content beforehand that we would present to the board. And I think, as Myrna and Debbie said, I think that, and they would agree, hopefully, is that having that relationship with board members, especially when you have a board member that is cybersecurity focused, could be invaluable. I mean, having those meetings prior to, in terms of what they're thinking about, what they want to hear about, not being blindsided by that prior to, and then partnering again with internal folks to make sure that we've got that information as well, is super critical.
And Kim, from your perspective?
Sure. So one of the, I'm sort of remiss in not mentioning it, another theme for 2021, I would say, is trust but verify. From the legal perspective, we have seen more enforcement orders, more regulatory requests that are asking not only for narratives and what policies are in place, but to prove it, you know, supporting documentation. So that has also required lawyers to get more involved, and they have been, you know, an evolving legal role in cybersecurity has been, you know, evolving for years, not just data breach response, but cybersecurity preparedness and understanding response plans and how to respond, but also for legal compliance programs and regulatory reviews, whole bunches of things where lawyers need to get involved, but they also need to really, you know, be side by side with security and not only understand, oh, we have a patch management program, but well, how do we know that we are abiding by the regularly patch schedules we have in place? You know, what do our risk assessments look like? How do we know that we're NIST? You know, we are benchmarked in a certain way against the NIST cybersecurity framework. So that helps not only because it might be required pursuant to a FTC order or otherwise, but also as you think about CCPA, you know, having reasonable security in place is again an important concept. So the lawyers really need to be involved in understanding where their security program is and getting into the weeds, working with security. Again, it's a sort of the theme of the interdisciplinary collaboration. It's requiring lawyers to really understand, trust, but verify. And that's also what organizations are doing and need to be doing with the vendors, particularly those vendors that have their sensitive data.
And I would add, it's in terms of the lawyers, it's the cybersecurity advisory team and also the privacy advisory team. And so many times those are really inseparable now when we talk about incident management, incident protection, and incident response, to make sure that you have the right people in the organization coming together. And it doesn't always work right. So Alicia, what happens when companies mess up? And I think 2020, we've seen a lot of really significant actions in this area. Talk to us a little bit about that, please.
Interestingly, one of the panelists said, several minutes ago about figuring out what's good enough, and embedded in that is really making a good go of it, both with internal transparency and external transparency. There are always, I like to say, there are always a lot of spinning plates. And if you're always really trying to act with high integrity, have a high bar for best practices, and lean in that direction, I think directionally that's the way to go. So what happens when you mess up? Escalate both to your board and your executive leadership team to step back, take a thought to how would this affect our customers, the ecosystem, and then really figure out who do we need to tell and partner with to get this fixed, if you will. I think what we've seen is sanctions and problems being created from cover-ups, right? The lack of willingness to share it both during, let's say, an incident gone awry, but afterward. We've seen shareholder derivative suits, valuations in companies go down, M&A activity being reevaluated because there was not the lack of transparency, and something that I like to try and lead, and I think should be led by all of us, is that what we should be doing is uncovering, remediating. It should be part of your corporate or organizational governance to continuously improve. And some of that is doing real-time evaluation, postmortems, coming up with strategies to do better.
Great, thanks. And you've alluded to a lot of different examples where there have been problems, right? This in 2020, we saw the first criminal action for someone related to the response to a data breach. And people have described that as bad facts, bad law, but with the Uber situation of trying to recharacterize what was a hack as part of a bug bounty program. And that's a pending litigation now. And also with the M&A context we saw a couple of years ago, right, with the devaluation of the Yahoo price and the Verizon takeover, when that was discovered of the security issues there. And then Marriott, when it merged with Starwood and didn't appreciate that it was inheriting a big data breach, which really then calls into mind the importance of due diligence, and also the Capital One case this year with the $80 million action, which focused on and pending additional civil class actions, but it focused on the need for board oversight and executive team management and policies. But back to the question of the mergers and acquisition context for us a bit. Myrna, you have time in the VC world, and how should this concern be addressed, or should it be addressed in that context as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll give you a perspective from my time in the venture capital space when we were, doing due diligence on early stage companies, which takes a very different look and feel from when I was at Comcast, and we would do due diligence on acquisitions at a larger scale to incorporate and built into our corporate enterprise. I think one of the things is that there's always a speed to these transactions. And more I'm seeing that boards are saying, hey, pause. We need to spend the right amount of time to make sure that we are not purchasing a toxic asset. The question then becomes, who do you involve? How far is that due diligence process take? Do you involve third parties? It's usually one of the most lucrative opportunities. So you're not violating any disclosure issues by having employees do due diligence on an asset. But one in particular strategy that we always employed, and it's not very sophisticated, we always said, assume you are purchasing a breach. So assume that you are going to make this purchase and that we will find a challenge, be it a data challenge, an infrastructure, architecture challenge, whatever the case may be. And by going into that with the eyes wide open, you circumvent the surprise, the aha moment, where now you have to devalue something, or there's this challenge of like, oh my God, what did we purchase? Assume that you were buying a vulnerability, assume that you were buying a breach. What would we do? And of course, there's so many different imperatives depending on the industry, depending on the service at hand, and depending on how the organization may put that into play. In the early stage company work that we did, we had the luxury of pulling the covers back and doing code reviews on products and doing a tremendous amount of due diligence, because at the end of the day, these are early stage companies and your risk factors go way up in that regard.
Right. I think that's a really smart way to look at it as well, because you're going in, as you said, eyes wide open, assuming the breach. I think people are then more likely to ask the right questions and to bring in the experts necessary to give an appropriate look to that. So I would say there's the trust but verify. What you've advocated is a zero trust and verify. So I'm all for that. And I think given the spate of attacks and threats and the speed at which they're coming, it's a thoughtful approach. To make the challenge worse, when an organization is on a global landscape, there is a lot to navigate. So Caroline, in looking at dealing with a global enterprise and shifting laws and other things, what are some of the questions that should be asked or answers that you can provide on how to attack that?
Yeah, and one point to build on what Kim was saying in introducing the trust but verify and the prevalence of these requests from regulators about, well, show me what you're doing. An approach that can be helpful to a multinational company is to keep a database of all of the responses that one gives to regulators. And you would be astonished at how many responses that database would include if a company operates in a number of jurisdictions. And make sure that those responses in this area are all consistent internally, because it is all one company. And that's surprisingly challenging. I mean, it's to keep track of, and I think it's really important. But as the law continues to unfold, a few years ago, everybody was talking about GDPR and how would we all deal with that coming in, and now that we've had a few years since the regime has been enforced, we've seen some huge penalties assessed in the first instance that have been negotiated down to smaller amounts thus far. But, that's still a very important regime that has to be followed if you're dealing with any information relating to EU residents. But in each country around the world, there's often a different set of requirements, a different set of standards. So for example, if you think that you've been breached in Bermuda, you have to tell the regulator if you're sure that there's been a material impact to yourself or to your customers. In New York, you have to report to the New York Department of Financial Services if you reasonably suspect, and so, each time, really, you have to know if there's an incident, where the incident occurred, and so that you're looking at the right laws, and it may be that the incident is affecting you across all jurisdictions, which is even more challenging. There's been the Schrems litigation, which has created more challenges to the transfer of data, which is something that would happen routinely for many multinational companies for no nefarious reason, just to do business, and the invalidation of the privacy shield, which was something that I know when I was in government was something the intelligence community was working very hard to try to help sustain. And interestingly, in September, the Departments of Justice, Commerce, and the Director of National Intelligence issued a report explaining how companies could sort of try to push back on that decision. I'm not sure how much comfort that provides, to the actual company. I think that most companies are probably relying on standard contractual clauses, which again may be a little bit in jeopardy. And then you have countries that have these nationalistic, I would say, laws about data has to be stored where they are. And there could be significant security concerns with doing that, depending on the country. It might be a country where notorious for theft of proprietary information, for example, and you wouldn't want necessarily to have all your data have to be stored there. And so it's something that's definitely quite challenging to keep track of.
So third-party risk is a huge and significant concern, as mentioned in the opening comments, and the recent news this week was about attacks on the supply chain of COVID vaccines aimed at the cooling technology that keeps it at the right temperature in transit. What for an organization addressing this issue from different perspectives, but Jen, you've worked on this issue from both government and private sector. What are some of the key thoughts in managing third-party risk?
Yeah, so I think as we shared in our prep call, the idea that the government is rolling out its framework on the cybersecurity maturity model certification as a requirement to be able to do business with the government is really an indicator of how large the problem is, and the mandate for this framework. To steal shamelessly from the previous topic, I would also say, from a due diligence perspective on vendors, don't trust and verify. And it's a risk-based framework, that they have to obviously self-assess and self-report, but you also have a series of tools to employ as, an internal, outside looking in, inside looking out. And, it's not any one, but certainly based on a number of different inputs, then escalating the scrutiny with those reviews. So because obviously you can't afford to do everything for every vendor, but so you want them to be well-informed and risk-based. And when you have something wrong, it's almost like everyone is, can say stop when something anomalous shows up, because I think in many of our, shared experiences that when something goes wrong down the line, someone can always come back and go, yeah, I thought that was, there was something wrong with that. And so everyone gets to call a halt to crowdsource or surge on a potential risk associated with the vendor. But definitely, in all of our experiences, vendor risk is our risk. And so I think most businesses are escalating that appropriately.
Carolyn, are there metrics that can be put in place for monitoring?
I think it's important to, agree with everything that Jen said. It's important to make sure that as part of the agreement you come to with the vendor up front, that you have auditing capability and that you're continuously monitoring. So first you have the front end risk assessment, but then it's really important to continue that. And as you're conducting the front end review, interestingly, I think people are important, so I've talked to CISOs who have said that, particularly for significant vendors who pose a great deal of risk in terms of the type of information that they are holding, they talk CISO to CISO, because they can get a sense then of the sophistication and the care that the vendor is applying, in the hope that it will be similar to the sophistication and care applied by the company that is using the vendor. I think those are some of the key things to focus on.
I'd love to jump in just to follow up on what Carolyn said about some of the risks here, and it's interestingly related to us working from home with COVID and the diffuse workforce, and that's use of third-party applications. Which version is the employee using at home? Are they using the enterprise-approved one that has all the bells and whistles and the liability terms and conditions? Or are they maybe using a consumer version, which may not have the same level of security, certainly won't have the same terms and conditions. And I worry about what employees are doing at home to get their job done. Are they using the approved methods of communicating and getting their work done?
And Kim,
just to build on that, Alicia, I know that there's some collaboration tools, which of course people are using more now that we're all working from home, but that are of significant danger, in terms of being able to be intercepted or infiltrated in an adverse way, that NASA and SpaceX and I believe Google have said, you cannot use those apps to their workforce.
Right.
Can I go back on third-party risk to something Jen said? We're often in the position of representing the company where there was a vendor incident that happened and the regulator is inquiring about the company's vendor risk management program. And I think more often than not, the vendor risk management program usually suffices, and there's not no red flag issues that the regulator finds. But the problem is that it's the ongoing monitoring where there's issues that are discovered that there aren't steps taken to really address those issues. And it may be on ongoing risk assessments, long-term, remediation plans for vendors where really true, the issues that then were responsible for the vendor's breach had been identified by the company and just not fully worked with the vendor to remediate, is just a common occurrence, as well as situations where there's been, multiple incidents of that vendor until the more significant incident happens. So those are what we try to work on with our clients, not as much of the front end risk rating and vendor risk management program, but it's the ongoing monitoring and ensuring the resources are in place to help sort of carry through unidentified risks.
That's great. And I've been working our Q&A in throughout as things have come up in the chat, but one has come from my friend Michelle Chapp in New Jersey, who wants to know, what do the panelists think about reps and warranties insurance in the context of the cyber breach that you're purchasing in an acquisition? So Myrna, you want to take that one?
You were gonna pick on me first. I think you.
Well, she's my friend, but also a cybersecurity expert.
Yeah,
yes.
But I think you may already have a little bit of a purview. I am the antithesis of thinking that cybersecurity insurance is a defense practice. I think, yes, there are policies, there are reps and warranties that you can purchase and hedge, but at the end of the day, whether it's with a third party, whether it's an M&A activity, at the end of the day, the liability is yours. Yes, you may be able to circumvent some expenses associated with some containment or some remediation, but I'm a firm believer that the job that we do as cybersecurity professionals is protecting the brand, and I don't think that an insurance policy is going to protect my brand. The customer, the stakeholders, the shareholders are not going to be sympathetic. And I've seen this, it's been so visceral for me, where I've walked into a variety of settings where someone would say, oh, but we got cybersecurity insurance, we're going to be okay. No, I just have a very visceral reaction to that approach.
I have to chime in on this one. I 100% agree with Myrna on this. And it feels to me as though most companies that purchase it's a check the box for some compliance requirement like a SOC 2 or ISO, or because they know they're going to be asked in a vendor questionnaire, do you have cybersecurity insurance, that it's not really going to protect your brand or help you in the case that you have a breach or a major incident. So couldn't agree more with Myrna.
I can say from practice, there have been situations there where companies have cybersecurity insurance that it has been critical to the survival of the organization, and it is an essential part of a cyber risk management plan. And to understand, having that as valuable, and we saw it in a major shareholder derivative action as well, where a large settlement was covered by insurance. But as to the specific reps and warranties in the context of a cyber breach, I think we go back to the don't trust and verify and see what are you acquiring, and how much can you do for your own homework to know the answers of that in the acquisition context.
There may be an opportunity for another discussion around the underwriting process of policies and how the firms actually evaluate a company's ability to manage cybersecurity. I think that's another element that could change the whole paradigm of the opinion of whether it's critical to your portfolio of defenses. Agree with you completely that it should be one of many, but I think the underwriting process and how an insurance provider says you are worthy of this type of coverage or not is important. And if it's self-assessment, I would be suspect.
Yeah, Myrna, if I could just jump in there. I completely agree with you, and the underwriting process is critical. Just like now people always wear seatbelts, hopefully, when they're driving. That is something that came through the work of the insurance industry in part, and the motivation that drivers and passengers have, to wear those seatbelts. And it's exactly the same kind of paradigm for cyber insurance carriers. It's critical, and there's all kinds of information that can be provided to a client regarding these are the best practices. This is where you fall on those best practices. Because I think everybody ultimately, with everything evolving as quickly as it does in the cyber world, you want to be behaving reasonably. You want to be behaving consistently with what the best practices are. And so I think it can really help a company to understand where they should be prioritizing their resources, as we were talking about before, that are not limitless. And so we as an insurance carrier, very much want to focus on that prevention, hand in hand with our clients.
Debbie, you mentioned in your opening about your very important work on election security, and thank you for that. What can you tell us looking ahead to 2020 as we gear up again for midterm and state and local elections? What worked well? What things should be considered as a bipartisan issue of ensuring the security of our nation's election systems?
Sure. I mean, the things that worked well, and we've been hearing about that quite a bit, is that, I believe government and industry and just partners worked together so well, for the good of the democracy. And so, hats off, a big shout out to companies that provided, cybersecurity companies that provided their products and services to campaigns, either free or at greatly reduced cost. I mean, I think that's been a game changer, really, because many of these campaigns don't budget for cybersecurity. They don't have cybersecurity expertise, unless we're talking, at the senior most level, highest level of our government. And so being able to get some of those products and services to them, and also then deploying scenario training. DHS did a phenomenal job, I believe, in getting out into the communities at the state level and providing training, to awareness, and then training, and then reinforcing that training. Work that was done to verify and validate systems, and to teach election systems IT professionals what to look for and how to manage those systems, all went a long way, I think, towards making it really a good outcome from a process and a security perspective. And that's what we're going to be focused on going into 2021, looking ahead to the midterms, is continuing to get those products and services out, continuing to reinforce this culture of security that, again, it's just not inherent in a campaign environment or in the election cycle, but helping them understand how important it is, and they can get some comfort, so that, again, regardless, it's a nonpartisan issue. Regardless of the outcome, it can happen, right? Elections can happen in a free and fair way.
I think that it's time to read another, or Elizabeth would please read our CLE code. And then I'm going to pick up on the election point as I go to you, Rinky. But Elizabeth, what is the magic code, please?
So the second code is shortage 88. I'll spell it out for those of you that are listening. SHORTAGE88. And to clarify, we've had a few questions about this. The first code that you received earlier in the meeting, that should go on the form under course code, and this should go for code 2. So to repeat, it is shortage 88, SHORTAGE88.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I don't know if those are random, but I would address the shortage of powerful women and people of color in cybersecurity, and we need more. But a lot of what our work shows that there are amazing women in this space. I think we're not done yet, but again, just so privileged to be with all of you for the discussion. I know there's so much more that we could cover, but in our last chunk of time together. Rinky, you went to Twitter, was it just after the election and just before the breach? Or maybe I have that reversed, right? But tell us your story, and in the context, well, just that answer, but in the context of your opening comments on the responsibility of the narrative and securing the platforms to protect public discourse.
Yeah, it's the reason I joined Twitter. And yeah, I joined after the breach, but before the election, which I think all my security peers were like, we don't know whether to say congratulations or my condolences. It was a really exciting time for Twitter, but it was also painful in the spectacle that followed around the conversations around Section 230 and just how do we ensure that the public conversation is protected. And I wanted to come and help secure the platform to ensure that exactly happens, that we do protect the public conversation. And I don't know, for those of you that had watched the hearings with Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg and Surinder Pichai talking about what needs to happen to ensure that first, that Section 230 has stayed up to par with current state and just where the internet is and where these platforms have come. But I think one thing is clear that needs to happen is there needs to be more transparency in how these companies are tagging misinformation, how we identify misinformation, and the fact that you get to choose as an individual what algorithms apply to you as well. And I think that's where things need to change in terms of security. That also came up, that did the companies have the right controls in place to ensure that misinformation didn't spread further, or that really critical information that comes onto Twitter and Facebook isn't suppressed in some way because of a cybersecurity incident. So those are some areas, around just transparency and the regulation that may be introduced. That's still a story that will be written in, I think, the next few months to the next year, a few years coming up. But I think there's no question in terms of now it's starting to get even more regulated in terms of the cybersecurity controls, privacy controls that the platform has to have in place. So it's, very interesting time to join, and we have a lot of challenges up in front of us here.
And Alicia, with the concern about disinformation and control of disinformation, there's also then the concern about protecting First Amendment rights. How do we reconcile that?
Sorry, was that question for me?
Oh, well, sure, if you want to talk I was directing to Alicia, but if you want to chat on that, Rinky, and then Alicia, I'm going to go to you in a moment then. Yeah.
Go ahead, Alicia, you take it.
Okay.
Sure, yeah, I imagine we might answer this somewhat similarly. I think an analysis starts with a really good internal discussion around acceptable use policy. Having a good idea about how users can use your platform, what's safe both for the platform but other users, and being very transparent about that as sort of a baseline. And then from there, it gets really tricky about how you handle that conversation. I certainly don't have a lot of answers, but running internal scenarios and use cases, having those conversations, that are, running up to the election, what could happen, including your executive leadership team about drawing those lines. Is very important, but it's incredibly context specific, and building that muscle for how you want to represent your corporate company reputation is very important. And I think it's going to vary based on company, which sector you're in, and it's really difficult. I'll turn it back over to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, I think a lot of questions around freedom of speech have come up on this, where, Twitter at least has taken the stance that we're not the source necessarily of truth, although many do come to us for source of truth type stuff. And we don't want to be in the place where we're controlling freedom of speech. And so I think that's where my previous comments around what happens with the rules around transparency and algorithms in terms of what information is showing up is largely controlled by algorithms today, in terms of what information shows up in your Twitter feed based on who you follow and who you choose maybe not to follow. And so I think all of those things really need to transform to be more modern and put more choice in front of the users versus the companies having all the control.
So in our closing moments, I want to ask each of you just to give two bits of advice. And again, you are all such experts. We could garner a lot more advice from you. And I just wish we had more time together. So thank you. And thank you to our audience with the wonderful comments and questions. We do anticipate that the program will be available live on our Women Leaders in Cybersecurity.org website, which also is now in process of being rebuilt to show our prior awesome events of the last 5 years. And I thank you again to our sponsors for making this all possible, Craig Newmark Philanthropies and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and for this panel sponsor, Alston and Bird. I'm proud to be affiliated with NYU for our Women Leaders in Cybersecurity programming. But that was all. Now just the closing comments for you women leaders and leaders of women, all of that. One point of quick cybersecurity advice and one point of quick career advice, kind of top of mind. What should we all know, or what would you tell your younger self on both those issues right now? I'm going to just go from here. I'll go in the order of when we started. So Kim, you're up. You're muted. So your advice has to come.
There we go. There we go. Thank you. Sorry about that. And thank you so much for putting together such a fabulous panel and inviting me to participate. It's been truly a great conversation. One piece of career advice would be if you have a technology interest, to pursue that passion. There's so many different ways now, especially in law, to pursue that, to learn. There's so many great opportunities in women groups in particular. And we just formed a Women in Cyber initiative, as you mentioned earlier this year, to help bring together younger generations, older generations, women who love technology, security, law, and others. So that's career advice. From a cybersecurity perspective, I would stick with global data breach response plans. Make sure you're keenly aware of the notification requirements for all of the key countries in which your corporation operates. Understand the timing requirements, the cultural aspects, the type of data that triggers notification, and how all of that would inform your investigation response and your investigation approach and your notification response. So lots of planning in that area.
Thank you. Myrna?
Piece of advice: have your cybersecurity legal counsel on speed dial. Have a retainer in place for a forensics organization to come in and help you with breach response. And from a career perspective, for those of you that are interested in cybersecurity, I think that this panel has shown you the diversity of journeys. So don't get pigeonholed into one particular journey. Diversify that.
And if you don't see it, make your own.
Amen.
Debbie.
So Myrna has literally, she has said my things. So she's like my alter ego, I think. So, 100%, from an advice perspective and really from a career perspective, I think when we say cybersecurity, a lot of times, folks think deep technical IT, computer scientist, writing code. This field is so much broader than that. We have, I think, maybe 4 attorneys maybe here with us today, at least that I know about, maybe more.
Our panel is 3 and 3, but I might be a written attorney too.
Yeah, I think you are. Yes. So we have, but also we need managers, we need policymakers, who because there's so much policy to still be discovered and written. And so don't pigeonhole yourself by thinking, if I'm not good at coding, if I'm not good in math, then I certainly can't be good in cybersecurity. That's so far from true. So I'd encourage folks. And then just from a pure cybersecurity perspective, it's still the basics for me. Strong passwords, 2-factor authentication, leveraging the cloud, and being aware, being cyber aware of your environment.
I'm an attorney, so I don't do math. Our panel is 4 and 4, counting me. Caroline.
So in terms of the career advice, I'd say don't be afraid to take risks, and in your career. And if you have an opportunity to do something completely different, go for it, and have confidence that you can do it and you can learn a new subject area. And on the cyber advice, I would say, remember that people and human beings, are the weakest link in terms of security. And so try what you can to keep training engaging and interesting. We have a little button you can click when you think you've gotten a phishing email. And so once in a while, when you click that button, it says, congratulations, you've identified, a fake phishing attempt that we've installed. And I always feel happy when I get that congratulations email. So motivate people however works for them.
Brigadier General Buckner, what's your advice for all of us?
Well, I like that you called out lawyers. That's a common, whether I was in government or now on the private sector side, that the lawyers are still my best friends. No, I can't get away. But I would +1 to the diversity of talent that's required in this space. And I would just say that, I would offer that intellectual humility, because I know that there are a lot of, really technical people, but we need everyone in this space, and we have everything to learn from, our multidisciplinary team. So little intellectual humility in cybersecurity goes a long way. And then I would highlight we've highlighted all of the opportunities for cybersecurity positions, but I would make a huge call out to mid-career professionals looking for transitions, because I think their life experience, their professional experience, this isn't, just a young person's game, that we can really bring that leadership and managerial expertise in. So I love the opportunity space here for mid-career transitioning professionals.
And Alicia.
I paired everything that the ladies have said thus far. It's been really wonderful career advice. I'll add to that just that this space needs diversity of thought. We need you. Be bold. Don't be afraid to take chances and find good people to work with. That's where you'll find the good work.
And Rinky, last but not least, our recognized Global CISO Award person. Tell us what's your advice for us?
We need so much more innovation in cybersecurity. And the only way it's going to happen is if we take big risks and continue to break things. So I would say that as we're trying new things and new solutions, which we need to do, break things, take big risks, and do them early in your career if you can.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for sharing your time with us. Thank you, dear audience members. A big shout out and thanks to Sarvanas Bakhtiar and Elizabeth Watcott, who keep all the magic running behind the scenes to make this possible in the netherworld and in the real world as well. So we're so happy to continue our programming despite a national, global pandemic, and glad that we could all get together from here. Look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events, Privacy in February and others to follow, and hopefully another time soon in person as well. So thank you for joining us. For my panelists, I'm going to do something that's a little bit goofy right now, but we're going to take a screenshot, because if it were live, we'd all have, the photographer would take our picture, and we're taking live ones, but this way we can just pose for a moment, indulge us. Audience, you don't have to sit for this, but I'm just going to count to 3, and then somebody, our wonderful logistics person, is going to take our picture. So 1, 2, 3. Thank you. So great. Wonderful to see you all. Be well, be healthy. Happy New Year. So bye-bye. Thank you.